We are facing each other, both producing a continuous vocal sound. We slowly build up the tension, our faces coming closer together until we are screaming into each other's open mouths.
Within the realms of performance art, Marina Abramović is undoubtedly one of the most celebrated and controversial female artists yet known. Her work has captivated and shocked many for its intensity, its rawness, and its willingness to push the boundaries of human endurance. Although she began her career as a painter, in time she would turn her attention to performance art in the early 1970s, where she would start exploring themes of the body, pain, and trauma. She's been known to put herself in extreme physical and emotional states, testing the limits of what her body and mind could withstand, as well as how the viewing public would interact. Over the years, Abramović has continued to create challenging and innovative work. She has performed in some of the world's most prestigious museums and galleries, and her work has been featured in numerous films and documentaries, and continues to do so to this day. Together we'll be taking an intimate look at Abramović's life, from her early childhood to the woman she is today, as well as discussing her work from the rarely heard of to her most infamous, in hopes to understand what drives her to create such extreme and challenging art. Just how exactly has Marina Abramović become such a complex and fascinating figure? How does she become a pioneer in the field of performance art? And how has her work challenged and inspired audiences for decades? Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to see more content on the weird and wonderful side of art. And with that said, welcome to another video, everyone. This is the story and performance art of Marina Abramović. Marina Abramović was born on November 30th, 1946 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, now in modern-day Serbia. Described by her as a dark place, young Marina's hometown and country were under communist dictatorship rule, with General Josip Broz Tito in charge. She often looked back on her surroundings as being terribly depressing and oppressive. However, she would also consider her and her family somewhat luckier than most. Abramović's parents were both Yugoslav partisans during World War II, who were both awarded high positions in the post-war government and celebrated as war heroes. According to Abramović, her parents' first meeting could easily be described as nothing short of a dramatic fairy tale in the midst of terrible bloodshed. Her mother, Danica, was a major in the army, fighting on the front line and protecting wounded partisans. During a German advance, she came down with typhus and was lying unconscious among the badly wounded, with a high fever and covered in a blanket. She was close to death until Marina's father, Voyan, would come across her dying body, struck by her beauty. He quickly carried her to the nearby village, where the peasants would nurse her back to health. Within just 6 months, she was back on the front line, saving yet more injured soldiers, one of which would be none other than Voyan himself, horribly wounded and bleeding to death. Instantly recognizing the man who rescued her, she sprung to action, but there was no available blood for transfusions. However, by some miracle, she discovered she had the exact same blood type as him, and so would give him her own blood, saving his life as he had saved hers. After the war, they crossed paths once again and married not long after. Her father worked with state security and the elite guard, whilst her mother directed an institute that supervised historic monuments, as well as becoming the head of a museum of art and the revolution in Belgrade. When Marina was born, her mother was leading a party meeting when a water broke. To emphasize just how committed to their political positions her parents were, Marina claimed that her mother refused to go to the hospital to give birth until the meeting was over. Marina was also born prematurely, resulting in a difficult birth. The placenta did not come out completely, causing her mother to develop sepsis. Once again, she was nearly on the verge of death and had to stay for a long period at the hospital until she recovered. Over the years, while her parents continued to work committedly to their careers, Abramović would hardly receive any parental care by either of them, resulting in her first 6 years being under the care of her maternal grandmother, Milica Lozic. Her grandmother was a deeply spiritual woman, a staunch devotee of the Orthodox Church, and Abramović's early childhood was deeply influenced by her grandmother's faith. When Abramović turned 6, her younger brother Velimir was born, and she would subsequently move back in with her parents into her family apartment. But in truth, the worst was yet to come. It's worth remembering that for the first 6 years since Marina was born, her parents at this point were practically strangers to her, only ever visiting her and her grandmother once a week. They were also increasingly distancing from each other as a married couple, possibly since before Marina was even born. Despite their love story and the initial attraction to each other during the war, their marriage was falling apart little by little with each passing year, dissolving into constant fights that would only become increasingly intense. This was attributed to many causes, one being their polar opposite backgrounds and interests. For example, her mother was from a wealthy and well-educated family, with refined tastes for the arts, and who viewed communism as a more abstract, idealistic, and even fashionable idea. Her father, on the other hand, was from a more modest and self-made military family, communist through and through, who enjoyed more simple pleasures such as drinking with his friends. It would not be long until the romance faded completely, only for them to realize how little in common they actually shared with each other. Though the further you dive into how Abramović described her childhood, it's more than likely that the main strain of their marriage was caused by her father and his love for women. Very often, he was unfaithful to Danica, making their crumbling relationship even worse and her confrontations with him more violent. Sadly, Marina too would suffer frequent violence at the hands of her mother as well. Almost on a daily basis, she was beaten and slapped by her mother for even the slightest mistakes or the most minor offences. Over time, this would develop a specific phobia within Marina, a fear of her own blood. From the beatings, her nose would bleed constantly. One time when she lost her first baby tooth, the bleeding wouldn't stop for 3 months. Fearing that she may have had leukemia, her parents took her to the hospital, where she was diagnosed for having a rare blood disorder, and she had to stay at the hospital for almost a year. This period, according to her, was the happiest time of her childhood. Quote, "Everyone in my family was now nice to me. They brought me good presents, and everybody in the hospital was kind to me. It was paradise. The doctors continued to do tests and discovered that what I had was not leukemia, but something more mysterious. Maybe some kind of psychosomatic reaction to my physical abuse. I was given all kinds of treatments, then I went back home and the slapping and beating continued, but maybe a little less frequently than before." End quote. Another method of punishment included a dark, hidden closet known as a placard that she would sometimes be locked in for hours. Abramović would give a morbid recount on her experiences with this closet as follows. I was afraid of the dark, but this placard was filled with ghosts, spiritual presence, luminous beings, shapeless and silent, not at all frightening. I would talk to them. It felt completely normal to me that they were there. They were simply part of my reality, my life. From the moment I would turn on the light, they would vanish." End quote. Perhaps due to her mother's background in the army, young Marina was expected to endure punishments without question, expected to be toughened up into a soldier like her. But if Abramović described how her mother took complete military-style control of her, it would be quite the opposite between Marina and her father, Voyan. According to Marina, her father never punished or beat her, and this naturally drew Marina closer to him. Quote, "I remember he used to take me to carnivals and buy me sweets. When he took me out, it was rarely just the two of us. He was usually with one of his girlfriends, and the girlfriend would buy me wonderful presents, which I would bring back home. So happy, I would say, 'Oh, the beautiful blonde lady bought me all this,' and my mother would throw the presents straight out of a window." End quote. By this time in her childhood, the marriage between Voyan and Danica was as good as over, and the more Marina loved her father for his tenderness, the harsher the punishments were from her mother. However, if there was one thing left between Marina and her mother that would leave more of a positive impact on her during her childhood and throughout the rest of her life, it would be her eagerness and willingness to learn new skills within different cultures and art forms, which her mother greatly encouraged. From an early age, Marina took piano lessons and learned both English and French on a regular basis. Thanks to her parents' habit of pushing her daughter to read certain literature, Marina would also find escapism in reading books, at times only ever coming out of her bedroom to eat, then she would head back in her room, spending each hour of every day reading page after page. But most significantly, of course, young Marina took a particularly keen interest in art, and her parents, particularly her mother who adored the arts, would actively nurture this side to her personality, to a point where Marina would even have her own studio, complete with a proper easel. Marina would describe how her first paintings consisted mostly of her dreams, which Marina remembered very well and would write down, later to be painted. She recounted only using two colours each time she painted, a deep green and night blue. Quote, "I was always attracted to these two colours, I can't quite say why. For me, dreams are green and blue. I took some old curtains and made a long robe for myself in those precise colours, the colours of my dreams." End quote. As the years went by, Marina's father would buy her a set of oil paints and arrange a painting lesson with a partisan friend of his, an artist named Philo Filipovich, who painted abstract landscapes. During their first lesson together, he cut out a piece of canvas on the floor, opened a can of glue and threw it on the canvas. He then proceeded to add a bit of sand, some yellow, red and black pigments. To Marina's surprise, he then poured half a litre of gasoline onto the canvas, lit a match, and everything exploded. Afterwards, he turned to Marina and said, quote, "This is a sunset." After he left and the charred remnants had dried, Marina pinned it to the wall, totally in awe of it. However, after returning home to it after going on a holiday with her family, to her disappointment, the August sun had dried out the artwork so badly that the colour was gone and the sand, ashes and pigments had all fallen on the floor. The sunset had quite simply vanished. This incident left an incredibly profound effect on her, whether she knew it at the time or not. But certainly looking back on this event later in life, Marina realised that the end result proved to be entirely insignificant when compared to what truly captivated her the most, which was the process. It was the actual making of the art that left the lasting impact, rather than what was left behind. The journey instead of the destination. Perhaps this event alone would be what truly motivated her as time went on to eventually step away from the paints and the easel to head directly towards the beckoning call of performance art. Perhaps if it weren't for this one fateful meeting arranged by her father, Marina's life would have never taken shape as it has done so to this day. By the time Marina reached her adolescence, both within and outside her family home, life continued to be a terrible challenge for her. Often she and her brother were forbidden to bring friends home due to their mother's germophobia, resulting in them being very shy and bullied by the other kids because of it. Quote, "My teenage years were desperately awkward and unhappy. In my mind, I was the ugliest kid in my school, extraordinarily ugly. I was thin and tall, and the kids called me Giraffe. I had to sit in the back of my class because I was so tall, but I could not see the board, so I could not get good grades. Finally, they figured out I needed glasses. We're not talking about normal glasses. These were the ugly kind that came from communist countries, with thick lenses and heavy frames. So I would try to break them by sitting on them, or by putting them in a window and accidentally closing it." End quote. As her teen years progressed, the loveless marriage of her parents and the ever-tense atmosphere it created in the family household not only continued, but seemed to be reaching a terrible breaking point. When Marina turned 17, her parents threw a huge party and dinner to celebrate their anniversary, 18 years of supposedly happy years of marriage. But after everybody left, the chaos started again. Marina remembered her father uncharacteristically walking into the kitchen to clean up, starting with the 12 champagne glasses that were waiting to be cleaned. Turning to her, he said, quote, "Let's wash the champagne glasses, you dry." But within moments, his father broke the first glass he picked up to wash as her mother walked in, and she exploded with rage. Quote, "They had just spent several hours pretending to be happy as she built up all of that anger and bitterness. She saw the broken glass and started yelling at my father about everything, about how clumsy he was and what a disaster their marriage was and how many women he had slept with. He just stood there and I watched silently, holding this little towel in my hand. She yelled and yelled and my father said nothing. He didn't move. It felt like a Beckett play. After many minutes of her lamenting about all the shit in their marriage, she stopped, because he was not responding. Finally, he said to her, 'Are you finished?' When she replied yes, he picked up the other champagne glasses, and one by one, he smashed all 11 on the floor. 'I can't hear this 11 more times,' he said, and he walked out of the house. This was the beginning of the end." End quote. Sure enough, Marina's father and closest elder, aside from her grandmother, left for good not long after this very incident. This affected Marina so much that she was overcome with grief and suffered a nervous breakdown. Although her father had gone, the memory of her first painting lesson that he had arranged for her years prior still energized her mind to see new ways of experiencing and indeed creating art. And art by this time had truly become her sanctuary. She continued to paint at her studio at home until another profound experience happened to her that would again encourage her to see art as more than just paint on canvas. One day, when lying on the grass and looking up at the clear sky above her, she noticed 12 military jets fly over her, leaving white trails behind them. Quote, "I watched in fascination as the trails slowly disappeared, and the sky once more became a perfect blue. All at once it occurred to me, why paint? Why should I limit myself to 2 dimensions when I can make art from anything at all? Fire, water, the human body, anything. There was something like a click in my mind. I realized that being an artist means having immense freedom. If I wanted to create something from dust or rubbish, I could do it. It was an unbelievably freeing feeling, especially from someone coming from a home where there was almost no freedom." End quote. In 1965, Marina enrolled in the painting program of the Academy of Fine Arts in Belgrade, eager to begin her life anew, hone in on her creativity, and in many ways find freedom from the shackles of her militant mother. However, even in her young adulthood, whilst living under the roof of her mother, she still had to obey many of her strict rules, including a curfew of no later than 10 p.m, which would continue right up to her late 20s. As Marina continued to paint, the less she seemed to enjoy it. She had not discovered performance art yet, but nevertheless, she couldn't help but feel something was missing. It wasn't until she started completing paintings that were instead less accurate on a technical level and instead more abstract and deliberately ambiguous that she eventually felt she was reaching closer to a breakthrough. Pictures that made the viewer, as she describes it, a participant in the artistic experience. Pictures that demanded that imagination take place and that opened the door to her unconscious. All the while, she began to meet like-minded students in the academy who shared her disillusionment of the ever-changing and increasingly corrupt communist nation they found themselves in, and who too wanted to see beyond the limits of paint and find ways to put life itself into art. She would actively join political student campaigns and protests, and attend meetings for hours at a time discussing art and how it could evolve from the conservative ways that their professors were teaching it. During this period of the 1960s, especially in the West, everything seemed to be changing drastically, not just within politics and popular music, but within art as well. No longer was art seen as merely a commodity by new emerging artists, but due to a surge and growing interest of avant-garde experimentation, new concepts, such as performance art, were beginning to garner wider attention, especially amongst younger crowds within art schools and art scenes. And the Academy of Fine Arts in Belgrade would be no exception, as these new ideas began to leak into Europe. Abramović and her closest classmates paid close attention to the new art movements emerging in America, and she in particular was eagerly drawn to the performance side of artistic expression. Finally, Marina had found a viable opportunity to work with whatever surrounded her and unite it with her creative output and emotional expression. However, from the very beginning, it was met with almost complete rejection. Although avant-garde ideas were continuing to filter into Yugoslavia, the establishment still firmly rejected most of them, including performance art. Each of her ideas to create her first solo performance were continuously rejected by the Belgrade Youth Center. It would not be until the start of the 70s, when she completed her studies in Belgrade and enrolled at the Academy of Fine Arts in Zagreb as a postgraduate, that her ideas and concepts were beginning to receive further encouragement. Not to mention that for the first time in her life, she was living outside of her home city, away from the grip of her overbearing mother. Both freedom within art and life in general now lay at her feet. In spite of this, in 1971, after finishing her studies in Zagreb, she returned to Belgrade to be reunited with her lover and fellow conceptual artist, Nesha Pelipović, who shared her passion for new ideas in art and would soon become her husband between 1971 and 1976. After returning to her home city in 1971, in October, Abramović took part in an exhibition at the Student Cultural Center, planned as a counterpoint to the official October Salon exhibition organized by the government. It was here that she exhibited her first immaterial artwork, and by now, she had all but abandoned painting altogether. By 1973, Marina was fully immersed into a new and exciting medium of performance art, and constantly chasing new ideas and concepts of how to express herself, and in particular, of how to follow her desire to capture the brutality and violence that inspired her greatly. Maybe it was this burning desire that eventually led her to her first groundbreaking and controversial performance later that same year. The first of a series of intense performances that would later be known as the Rhythm Series, called Rhythm 10 in Edinburgh, Scotland. A performance of one artist, 12 knives, and the start of what Abramović would be forever famous for, which was the relentless endurance of a human body when pushed to its absolute limits. At the beginning of the 1970s, after marrying and completing her studies in art, Marina Abramović was taking her first steps as a full-time artist, though very little was changing in her life whilst remaining in her hometown of Belgrade in Yugoslavia. Marina still remained close to her former classmates from art school and continued to do various local exhibitions with them, mostly within the Student Cultural Centre in Belgrade, experimenting with visual effects and audio recordings, as well as putting her body through strange displays, such as wrapping her entire body in tape that would garner a wide range of reactions, from mesmerised to straight up repulsed. However, one visiting curator from Scotland was about to propel Marina's position within the art world further than she could have ever anticipated. Richard DeMarco, a Scottish artist and promoter of the visual and performing arts, was visiting Belgrade looking for fresh ideas for the next Edinburgh Art Festival. After a fairly uneventful trip, word eventually got round to him about a small group of postgraduate art students, Marina Abramović included, who were doing something far more outlandish and experimental compared to what the painting and sculpting scene could offer. With only one night left in Belgrade, he invited them to his hotel room to meet them, before travelling home the next day. Despite a fruitful meeting and an invitation for the group to attend the Edinburgh Festival, the Yugoslavian government officials escorting him bluntly refused, claiming that this kind of art would not appropriately represent the culture of the country. Following this, DeMarco decided to formally invite the group to make their own way to Scotland to attend the festival. Thankfully, Marina had saved up enough money to make the trip, and she didn't look back. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. After arriving in Edinburgh, she was invited to stay with friends of DeMarco, as she quickly got to work planning a performance for the festival, and already she was beginning to feel the pressure. This was her very first trip to the West as an artist, suddenly surrounded by some of the world's most infamous conceptual artists that would even make Marina's most shocking work look tame by comparison, such as a team of performers that included Günter Blues, who just a few years prior at the University of Vienna had conducted a performance that involved urinating into a glass, then proceeding to cover his body in his own excrement, singing the Austrian national anthem, whilst basically pleasuring himself. Never before had Marina felt like such a small fish in a very large and unpredictable pond. But nevertheless, she knew she was brought here for a reason. She knew she had something to offer that was different. And it was in fact her fortitude in the face of fear, her composure in the face of intimidation, and even extreme danger that would eventually lead her to her very first installment of arguably her most notorious body of work. Okay, so before I get into the details of Rhythm 10, I need to own up to quite an embarrassing mistake I made in part 1 of this ongoing documentary. Towards the end of the last video, I accidentally said that Rhythm 10 involved 12 knives instead of 10, which is straight up incorrect, and I'm still baffled as to how I said that and didn't even notice it during editing. Maybe 12 and 10 sounded similar to me at the time, I don't know. But I thought I'd mention this now just because the number of knives that Marina used is quite significant to the concept, and even the very title of the performance. So now that that's hopefully cleared up any potential confusion, let's continue. On the floor of the gymnasium of Melville College, one of the sites of the Edinburgh Festival, Marina Abramović unrolled a big sheet of heavy white paper, and on top, she would rest a collection of 10 knives of various sizes, with 2 tape recorders set aside. The stage was now set for Rhythm 10. Even by Marina's own admission, she knew what she was about to do was completely unhinged, and would retell this event in quite a gripping way. Quote, "Rhythm 10 was absolutely crazy. It was based on a drinking game played by Russian and Yugoslav peasants. You spread your fingers out on a wooden bar or table and stab down a sharp knife, fast, in the spaces between your fingers. Every time you miss and cut yourself, you have to take another drink. The drunker you get, the more likely you are to stab yourself. Like Russian roulette, it is a game of bravery and foolishness and despair and darkness. The perfect Slavic game. Beforehand, I was so nervous that I was scared I would get one of my incapacitating whole-body migraines. I could hardly breathe from the idea that I was going to do this. But I was also serious about what I was about to do, 100% committed. I was so serious about everything then, yet I think I needed this gravity. Much later on, I read a statement of Bruce Naumann's Art is a Matter of Life and Death. It sounds melodramatic, but it's so true. This was exactly how it was for me, even at the beginning. Art was life and death. There was nothing else. It was so serious and so necessary. With a big crowd watching, I knelt down on the paper and turned on one of the tape recorders. I had been terrified beforehand, but the second I began, my fear evaporated. The space I occupied was safe." End quote. As the performance was in full swing, Marina brought the knives down between her fingers on her left hand as fast as she could. And of course, because she was going fast, every once in a while she would miss, just slightly, and nick herself. Each time she did so, she would groan with pain. The tape recorder would pick it up, and she would switch to the next knife. After nicking herself 10 times with each knife, she would switch on the second tape recorder whilst replaying the tape of the first recorder in an attempt to repeat the same movements, attempting even to replicate the mistakes with each of the 10 knives again, merging the past with the present. Quote, "Pretty soon I had gone through all 10 knives, and the white paper was stained very impressively with my blood. I rewound the second tape recorder, played a double soundtrack of both performances. Then, I stood up and left. The crowd stared, dead silent, and a very strange feeling came over me, something I had never dreamed of. It was as if electricity was running through my body, and the audience and I had become one, a single organism. The sense of danger in the room had united the onlookers and me in that moment, the here and now, and nowhere else. That thing that each of us loves, with that you are your own little self privately. Once you step into the performance space, you are acting from a higher self, and it's not you anymore. It's not the you that you know, it's something else. There on the gymnasium floor, it was as if I'd become, at the same time, a receiver and transmitter of huge, Tesla-like energy. The fear was gone, the pain was gone. I'd become Marina, whom I didn't know yet. Listening to the wild applause of the audience, I knew I had succeeded in creating an unprecedented unity of time present and time past, with random errors. I had experienced absolute freedom. I felt that my body was without boundaries, limitless. "This was the moment I knew I had found my medium." End quote. Following the shock and the afterglow she experienced from her first ever solo performance as Marina Abramović with Rhythm 10, the last thing Marina wanted to do was go back to the more conservative art scene of Belgrade when the festival was over. Despite staying for as long as she could in the UK, working various jobs, it would not last. Her mother, Danica, found her a new teaching job back home, and she had to return to her home country once again. With the freedom she craved as both an artist and as a person, seeming to only last moments each time during this particular period of her life. But her head was still full of ideas for her next performance projects. She continued to save money with her new well-paid job in order to fund them. In fact, she would even get the chance to perform Rhythm 10 once again in Rome, this time using 20 knives instead of 10. And she would even receive a bigger reaction from the audience than before back in Scotland. The more like-minded artists she began to meet along the way, the more opportunities seemed to arise, and the more support she would receive to materialize her ideas, which would eventually lead her to begin her next controversial chapter within the Rhythm series, known as Rhythm 5. Quote, "The 5 in the title stood for the 5-pointed star. For 2 stars, really. There was the large 5-pointed wooden star I planned to build in the courtyard of a student cultural centre. And then there was the starfish-like extremities of my body, as I would lie inside it, my head and my outstretched arms and legs." End quote. Again, Abramović seemed obsessed to explore a theme of the body at its most challenged in the face of danger, and how an audience would interact, to a point when even fellow conceptual artists were warning her to be careful or to abandon the idea altogether. But nevertheless, the project would continue. The performance began with Abramović constructing the star made of wood and wood chips soaked in gasoline. She then lit the star on fire and proceeded to walk around it. She then cut her hair and threw clumps of it into the fire. Then finally, she lay down, right inside of a burning star. Abramović remained in the star for a total of 6 minutes, until the flames eventually reached her leg. The audience then realised to their horror in that moment, when she didn't flinch, that she was unconscious from a lack of oxygen inside the burning star. The doctors on standby then stepped in, and with the help of the audience, she was rescued from the flames that were practically only minutes away from killing her. One question you may have is, why did Abramović choose a star as a symbol for the performance? She would explain herself in her autobiography, titled Walk Through Walls, that the star had always fascinated her for its many meanings throughout history, within culture and religion, such as with ancient Egypt, paganism, and Abrahamic religions. The star has always been a significant symbol with different interpretations. But first and foremost, the star was quite simply a symbol of communism, and due to her upbringing and past experiences living in Belgrade, it in turn served as a symbol of oppression, totalitarianism, and of a world that she was so desperately trying to escape from. Despite the near disaster that came from the performance of Rhythm 5, according to Marina, it became quite a sensational hit. Not just for the daringness of the artist and the heroic acts of the onlookers, but mainly for the symbolic spectacle of the burning star and the image of a young woman trapped within it. However, the overall feeling Abramović herself would experience after the performance was one of bitter disappointment. She later commented upon this as follows: "I was very angry because I then understood there is a physical limit. When you lose consciousness, you can't be present, you can't perform." End quote. Deeply affected by this newfound realization for a newfound medium, she vowed that from now on, whatever her next project would be, she would make it her priority to use her body in and out of consciousness, but without it interrupting the performance. And thus, her next rhythm project, titled Rhythm 2, was conceptualized. Prompted by a loss of consciousness in Rhythm 5, Abramović devised the two-part Rhythm 2 performance to incorporate a state of unconsciousness in a performance. She performed the work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Zagreb in 1974, just a few months after Rhythm 5. For this performance, Marina had somehow acquired 2 types of medication from a hospital. For the first half, lasting roughly 50 minutes, she ingested a form of pill usually prescribed for catatonia, a condition that causes extreme motor immobility, in which said pill is supposed to force catatonic patients to move. The reaction would be extremely intense. Within just a few short minutes, Abramović reacted violently to the medication, experiencing involuntary muscle movement and even seizures. Though unable to control her body, Abramović remained completely lucid and could observe what was happening to her body throughout the entire ordeal. Quote, "I sat at a little table in front of the audience and took pill number 1. In a couple of minutes, my body was jerking around involuntarily, almost falling out of my chair. I was aware of what was happening to me, but there was nothing I could do to stop it." End quote. When the effects of the pill finally wore off, part 2 of the performance commenced. This time she took the second pill, a medication normally prescribed for the treatment of extreme aggression, depression, and schizophrenia. When this medication took hold, she remained physically unchanged, but she became completely mentally removed and could not remember the lapsed time. Quote, "This time I went into a kind of passive trance, sitting there with a big smile on my face, aware of nothing. And this pill took 5 hours to wear off." End quote. By now, word of this new reckless young performance artist named Marina Abramović was beginning to spread like wildfire. Before long, many establishments across Europe who were open to the conceptual side of creativity were eager to see this daredevil of the art world for themselves. One such place would be the Galleria Diagramma in Milan, who agreed to host Marina's next rhythm experiment, titled Rhythm 4. In this piece, Abramović kneeled alone and naked in a white room with a high-power industrial fan in front of her. As a video camera rolled the live footage to an audience in a separate room, she approached the fan slowly, pressing her face against it, attempting to breathe in as much air as possible to push the limits of her lungs. Soon after, she passed out. Quote, "In a couple of minutes, the great torrent of air filling my inside caused me to lose consciousness. I had anticipated this, but as with Rhythm 2, the point of the piece had been to show me in 2 different states, consciousness and unconsciousness. I knew that I was experiencing new ways of using my body as a material. The problem was that, as with Rhythm 5, I was perceived to be in danger. And while in the earlier piece, the danger had been real, this time it was only perceived. The Milan gallery staff, fearing for my well-being, rushed in and rescued me. It was not needed, it was not intended, but it all became part of a piece." End quote. Naturally, as the attention around Abramović's exhibitions continued to grow, so would her reputation. And back in Belgrade, it was mostly negative. The newspapers and media outlets spreading word of her performances would ridicule and demonize her. "What she is doing has nothing to do with art," they would say. "She's nothing but an exhibitionist and a masochist. She belongs in a mental hospital." As scandalous as her reputation appeared to be, criticisms such as these would only continue to grow and reach beyond her home country, and do so for the rest of Marina's career. Though it would be this exact reaction that would evoke the idea of her final chapter within the notorious Rhythm series, a piece that contestably stands as the most daring and perilous performance she has yet done, and one of the most bluntest displays ever produced in the art world of just how far the brutality of human nature can go if given the chance. Following the vocal reactions to her performances still fresh in her mind, Abramović could not help but wonder, what if instead of deciding what she would do to herself, what would happen if she let the public decide what to do to her? What would happen if she truly tested the limits of a relationship between the performer and the audience? That question would be answered in Studio Mora in Naples, Italy, with her piece titled Rhythm Zero. With an invitation from a gallery to perform whatever she wanted, Abramović got to work. The concept as a whole was relatively simple. Marina would stand in the middle of a room wearing black trousers and a black t-shirt, with the intention of being the object and the audience being the action. Nearby, in front of where Abramović was standing, she had placed 72 various objects on the table, which seemed to be a perfect mix of objects that represented either pleasure or pain. These items included, but were not limited to, a mirror, a feather, a fork, a bottle of perfume, a whip, a shawl, an axe, grapes, scissors, wine, needles, honey, a carving knife, a cake, a box of razor blades, lipstick, pins, sugar, and even a fully working pistol with a single bullet laying next to it, along with various other things ranging from utterly harmless to utterly dangerous. The instructions to this performance, now considered just as famous as the performance itself, were as follows. Instructions. There are 72 objects on the table that one can use on me as desired. Performance. I am the object. During this period, I take full responsibility. Duration. 6 hours, 8 PM to 2 AM. So at 8 o'clock in the evening, the performance commenced, and as the audience entered, they soon gathered around the table of objects. But things started rather timidly at first. Perhaps out of confusion or apprehension of seeing a strange young woman standing perfectly still behind a table of questionable objects, the audience during the first 3 hours of the show were being quite shy towards Marina. She would look back and comment on the performance as follows. I just stood there, staring into the distance, not looking at anything or anybody. Now and then, someone would hand me the rose, or drape a shawl around my shoulder, or kiss me. Then slowly, at first, and then quickly, things begin to happen. It was very interesting. End quote. From the available photographs that could be seen of this event, one thing you may have noticed is that surrounding Marina in most of these photos seemed to be predominantly a crowd of men. She would provide more insight into why this was so as follows. For the most part, the women in the gallery would tell the men what to do to me, rather than do it themselves. Although later on, when someone stuck a pin into me, one woman wiped the tears from my eyes. For the most part, these were just normal members of the Italian art establishments and their wives. Ultimately, I think the reason I wasn't was because the wives were there. End quote. As the evening went on and the early hours of the morning crept in, the atmosphere inside the gallery was beginning to grow more sinister with each passing minute. Quote, a certain air of sexuality arose in the room. This came not from me, but from the audience. We are in southern Italy, where the Catholic Church was so powerful, and there was this strong Madonna or dichotomy in attitudes towards women. End quote. After 3 hours had passed, one man decided to cut her shirt apart with the scissors and ripped it off her. Because Abramović was staying entirely passive throughout the whole ordeal, people started manipulating her into various poses, puppeting her in whatever way they pleased, while she was completely exposed from the waist down. As she continued to stand there, someone took the lipstick and wrote "Io sono libero," meaning "I am free," on the mirror and placed it in her hand. Someone else took the lipstick shortly afterwards and wrote "End" across her forehead. Another then took Polaroids of Marina and stuck them in her hands, like she was holding playing cards. From there, things would go from bad to worse, and the atmosphere got increasingly intense. A couple of people then decided to pick her up and carry her around. Then they put her on a table, spread her legs, and stuck the knife in a table close to her groin. Then someone started sticking pins into her. Another then slowly poured a glass of water over her head. Another man proceeded to cut her neck with a knife and suck the blood, leaving a scar that Marina still carries to this day. She would also mention one particular member of the audience that would affect her the most, a man that eventually approached her, standing close to her for a long period of time and breathing heavily. After a while, the exact same man would take the bullet, load it into the pistol, and put it in Marina's right hand. He then proceeded to point the pistol towards her neck and touched the trigger. At that very moment, a concerned murmur erupted from the crowd, and someone would have to grab hold of him, causing a scuffle to break out. The man eventually had to be hustled out of a gallery so that the performance could continue. Towards the tail end of the performance, however, is where this experiment would go from extremely telling of how dangerous the supposedly normal, everyday person could be to what would happen when that same person would face the reality of it. As Marina explains, quote, "In fact, the audience had become more and more active, as if in a trance. And then at 2 a.m, the gallerist came and told me that the 6 hours were up. I stopped staring and I looked directly at the audience. 'The performance is over,' the gallerist said. 'Thank you.' I looked like hell. I was half naked and bleeding. My hair was wet, and a strange thing happened. At this moment, the people who were still there suddenly became afraid of me. As I walked towards them, they ran out of a gallery." End quote. When it was all over, the gallerist then escorted Marina back to her hotel, where Marina went back to her room alone. Despite how exhausted she was, her mind was still racing, replaying moment after moment of the 6-hour-long experience. The event had in fact left her feeling so traumatized and affected that after a restless night's sleep, she woke up the next morning to discover that a streak of her black hair had turned grey. The gallery too would receive its own after effects of the event. The next day, the gallerists received dozens upon dozens of phone calls from those who participated, most of which were people who would apologize profusely for their actions, almost as if they didn't quite know what had come over them, as if something had taken control of them. But quite simply, according to Abramović, what had happened was human nature itself. At its most primal and elemental, it became part of a performance in the most interactive way possible. The art was now made by both performer and the audience, but the concept was so new to the audience that night that the consequences could have easily been far worse under different circumstances. The limits were tested just as planned, the risks were realized just as Marina had said, but ultimately, the results were far more disturbing than anyone could have ever predicted. And now both artist and the audience were deeply conflicted over the experience. As Marina would describe in her memoirs, quote, "Human beings are afraid of very simple things. We fear suffering. We fear mortality. What I was doing in Rhythm Zero, as in all my other performances, was staging these fears for the audience, using their energy to push my body as far as possible. In the process, I liberated myself from my fears, and as this happened, I became a mirror for the audience. If I could do it, they could do it too." End quote. Still married to Nesha Palapović and still sleeping under the same roof of her strict mother back in Belgrade, coming home at 10 p.m. each evening, Abramović was continuing to grow more distant from her place of origin, and more so after her eventful performance with Rhythm Zero. In her mind, Abramović felt truly nothing belonged to her anymore within her own country, even within her marriage to her college sweetheart. Whenever an opportunity abroad landed in her lap, she would take it without question, travelling anywhere she could and performing anything she could. It would seem her Rhythm series had well and truly kick-started her career, perhaps in the darkest direction possible, given the next string of side projects she would involve herself in during the early 70s. It would not be until 1976, when after moving to Amsterdam, Marina would find the most unlikely companion, a complete soulmate of creativity, who would practically help change the course of Marina's career forever, creating a dramatic story along the way that would be one of passionate romance, with the most bittersweet dissolution. In the summer of 1975, following the buzz and uproar that rippled across the art world with Rhythm Zero, Marina Abramović was invited to Vienna in Austria to perform pieces that were arguably much darker and much more graphic than anything she had performed before. Yet strangely, there isn't much information on these pieces except for what Marina herself writes about in her biography, Walk Through Walls. In the book, she details a rather grim performance that she was involved in, conducted by another controversial conceptual artist named Hermann Nitsch, who was predominantly infamous for creating dark and violent spectacles that often used nude performers and real blood within acts that replicated unholy and sacrificial rituals. The performance Marina took part in would be no different. Quote, "That summer, Nitsch staged a performance in a castle outside Vienna called Pritzendorf. The piece was to last 24 hours. There were 60 participants, including me. Most of the others were men. Some were naked, some were dressed all in white. I was placed on a wooden stretcher, naked and blindfolded, and the stretcher was leaned against a concrete wall. As gloomy music played, Nitsch poured sheep blood and organs, eyes and liver, over my belly and between my legs. Things got stranger from there. After this had gone on for 12 hours, I took off my blindfold and walked away. Not that I couldn't take it physically, I just didn't want to be part of it anymore. I understood it was not my thing. It was the enormous amount of animal's blood, and the fact that we had to drink it, and that it all took place in a chapel in the castle. It felt like a kind of black mass, or bacchanal. It seemed so negative to me, but at bottom it just was not my story, not conceptually or in any other way." End quote. Following this, Marina chose to stay in Vienna, where she would meet a Swiss artist named Thomas Lips, who she had a brief relationship with. Mixed with the profoundly horrific effect of the Hermann Nitsch performance and the brief fling with Thomas Lips, Abramović then became inspired to conceptualize her next performance in Vienna, which she would subsequently give the title Thomas Lips, or The Lips of Thomas. This performance again would have limited information surrounding it compared to her other work, with only a few photographs and video clips of the piece still existing today. The most well-known photograph being that of a 5-pointed star that Marina would carve onto her stomach. Marina would detail the performance in her biography as follows. "I slowly eat 1 kilo of honey with a silver spoon. I slowly drink 1 liter of red wine out of a crystal glass. I break the glass with my right hand. I cut a 5-pointed star on my stomach with a razor blade. I violently whip myself until I no longer feel any pain. I lie down on a cross made of ice blocks. The heat of a suspended heater pointed at my stomach causes the cut star to bleed and the rest of my body behind to freeze. I remain on the ice cross for 30 minutes until the public interrupts the piece by removing the ice blocks from underneath me. Duration 2 hours. End quote. Although the spectators, according to Abramović, were familiar with provocative art and performances, this particular piece proved to even be too much for them. After some spectators rushed to the stage to cover Marina in coats and help her off the ice, she then had to be taken to hospital, not for her wounds from the whip or the self-inflicted stars she cut onto her stomach, but for her right hand that she had unintentionally gouged when she broke the wine glass that would need a great deal of stitches. Towards the end of 1975, on Marina's 29th birthday, she received an invitation to take part in a new upcoming performance, this time in a gallery in Amsterdam known as De Appel, for the Dutch TV show called Beeldspraak. In early December, Abramović arrived in Amsterdam to meet the curator at the airport, who was accompanied by another individual, a German artist who went by the name of Ulay, who was to be Marina's guide and assistant for her performances. At that moment, Marina seemed to be instantly enthralled by him. Quote, Ulay, his real name I found out was Frank Uwe Leisiepen, but he never used it, was in his early 30s, tall and skinny, with long flowing hair that he tied up in the back with a pair of chopsticks, a fact that was immediately interesting to me because I did my hair the exact same way. But the other interesting thing was that the two halves of his face were different. The left side was shaved smooth and powdered, with a plucked eyebrow and light rouge on his lips. The right side was stubbly and a little greasy, with a normal eyebrow and no makeup. If you saw either side in profile, you would get a completely different impression, masculine on one side, feminine on the other. End quote. As she spent time with him in Amsterdam, they would discover quite surprising similarities to each other, the biggest coincidence being that they shared the same birthday of November 30th. As time went on, they spent more time with each other and began to form an incredibly passionate romantic relationship. But this ultimately would only be the beginning of a partnership that would change both of their lives quite significantly. Falling deeply in love with Ulay, a man who she truly felt was destined for her, made leaving Amsterdam to once again return to Belgrade all the more difficult. Not to mention that she was still married to Nesha Pavlović and living with her mother. It was a relationship riddled with forbidden desire and one that would have to be kept secret for a long time. On top of this, she was also forced to resign from her teaching job due to the emerging pictures of her rhythm performances that would cause a scandal. At this stage, Abramović was left with little choice but to plan her escape from Belgrade for good and to live with Ulay. She packed light, only taking a handful of belongings, with the majority of her things only being a portfolio of her work, and she secretly left on a train to Amsterdam, not once looking back. By 1976, not long after Marina's final departure from Belgrade, she and Nesha eventually divorced. Not long after moving in together, Marina and Ulay, realizing more and more how their perceptions of art were merged into one with their similar personalities, traits, and artistic backgrounds, they began planning performance art projects together. Inspiration for their first ever collaborative performance came from an unlikely item in their possession, a Newton's cradle. Ulay, for one, was absolutely fascinated in the motion of it and the illusion of the ball bearings essentially transferring energy and movement to each other. Therefore, the idea came to them both to do the same, to collide into each other and to merge their energy into one. Although the movements would not be as clean or precise as a Newton's cradle, Ulay and Marina both recognized the beauty in that, a rawness that could be encapsulated by the project, and thus the performance known as Relation in Space was conceptualized. Quote, "The idea of this piece was two naked bodies running and hitting each other frontally and increasing the speed for 1 hour. We really wanted to have this male and female energy put together and create something we called that self. It was very important to collaborate and to mix our ideas together and not ever say to anybody from whom the idea comes from. It was the mixture that really made sense to us and created that kind of third energy field." End quote. The performance took place for the annual Venice Biennale art event in a warehouse on the island of Giudecca in Venice, Italy, in front of a few hundred spectators. Microphones were apparently meticulously positioned in order to capture the sound of their increasingly intense collisions, which at some stages would send Marina collapsing to the floor. The idea as a whole was to perform something that was as minimalist as possible, and according to Abramović, nothing could be more minimal than two naked bodies in any empty space, and with the only sound being emitted would be two bodies slamming into each other. As for the reaction of the audience, as well as their interpretation, it was clear that they could sense Marina and Ulay were in love, but this added more mystery to their somewhat aggressive performance. Just who were they exactly? Why were they colliding? And was there some kind of hostility in their relationship being released in this bizarre display? These sorts of questions being projected from the audience, much like many of Marina's projects up till now, was the final ingredient to complete the artwork. Following Relation in Space, Marina and Ulay would make an ambitious decision. They decided they would leave the city of Amsterdam behind and give up most, if not all, of their possessions to completely focus on their performance art together. They purchased a corrugated iron van, which Ulay painted black, and they would spend 3 years living and travelling in it, devoting themselves completely to a nomadic lifestyle, free from all attachments and utterly dedicated to travelling to multiple places to perform their projects. Marina would look back on this particular time of her career as being one of the happiest periods of her life. During 1977, Ulay and Marina materialized many interesting concepts, all of which would have virtually no rehearsals nor any particular end goal. All that was planned would be the idea itself and the place and time to perform it. One of which would be the piece titled Relation and Movement. This involved the pair driving their van inside of a museum for 365 laps. A black liquid oozed from the car, forming a perfect circle. The idea was that each lap represented a year, and after 365 laps, they, quote, entered the new millennium. Another piece, titled Relation in Time, they set back to back, tied together by their ponytails for a total of 16 hours. As time went on, their hair would eventually come apart, strand by strand. They allowed the public to enter the room to see if they could use the energy of the public to push their limits even further. Another well-known piece, titled Breathing In, Breathing Out, was a particularly surreal, yet very simple performance that garnered wide attention. In this, the duo locked their mouths together and basically inhaled each other's exhalations until they had used up all the available oxygen. Quote, "We stuck cigarette filters in our nostrils to block the air, and we taped little microphones to our throats. We kneeled down facing each other. I blew all the air out of my lungs, and Ulay breathed in all the air he could. Then we clamped our mouths together, and he blew his air into my mouth. Then I blew the air back to him. As our mouths stayed fixed together, as the sound of our breathing, and then our gasping, was amplified, we exchanged again and again that one lungful of air, which became less and less oxygen and more carbon dioxide as it was exhaled time after time. After 19 minutes, there was no oxygen left. We stopped just before losing consciousness." End quote. It would also be during 1977 that one of Marina Abramović's trademark performances would first be conceptualized, the piece titled Imponderabilia, where Ulay and Marina, both completely nude, would stand in a narrow doorway, and in order for the public to pass to another section of the exhibition, they must squeeze sideways between them, and in doing so, choose which one of them to face. Many other performance artists as the years went by would recreate this concept in Marina Abramović retrospectives. I've actually personally witnessed this myself, and what I always find so interesting is seeing which one of the two performers a member of the public chooses to face towards when passing through. The pattern that I personally began to notice quite often is normally a woman chose to face the naked female performer and a man chose to face the male performer. As to why this is, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps society has conditioned people when in these types of situations to have more trust in their own gender, or that they feel that to face the naked member of the opposite sex could be disrespectful or perverse in some way. Either way, I thought it was fascinating to witness. Light Dark was a performance that again was creatively simple, yet surreal in execution. Ulay and Marina would kneel opposite each other and begin the performance by slowly slapping each other in the face. Much like Relation in Space, it began slowly but increased in pace as time went on. Ulay turns his cheek towards Abramović when she swipes at him, whereas Abramović turns her face away. The performance ends when Abramović ducks her head, evading the next slap. According to Ulay, Light Dark was supposed to express the relationship between man and woman. As he explains, quote, "We expressed the various aspects between men and women. The work wasn't only about ourselves. Our relationship made the work possible, but the performances were not a direct image of our private relationship." End quote. Marina too would comment on the piece, saying, quote, "It is not the pain itself that matters. We never did things for the pleasure of pain. We were looking for a key, a way to break through the body, to open something up, which is a desire that comes from another side of truth or reality." End quote. In the following year of 1978, Ulay and Marina conceptualized the bizarre performance known as, I guess. Let's just go with that. Here they stood opposite each other and made long sounds with their mouths open. Gradually they would move closer and closer to one another until eventually they would yell directly into each other's open mouths. The performance would last 15 minutes, by the time both artists' voices would end up out of sync and failing from the continuous yelling. The purpose of this piece was to demonstrate their interest in endurance and duration, as well as exploring aggression between physically present figures, one male and one female, not too dissimilar from the concept of the Light Dark performance. But one project of performance art by Marina and Ulay, from a certain point of view, would be a callback to a much earlier performance of Marina's. Her infamous Rhythm Zero performance back in Italy was without a doubt an experiment of surrendering complete and utter trust to the audience in order to complete the artwork. But when it came to the 1980 performance of Rest Energy, this time she would offer her trust and vulnerability entirely to her lover, Ulay. Although only lasting 4 minutes, Marina would look back on this performance as one of the hardest pieces she's ever had to do. Quote, "I was not in charge in Rest Energy. We actually held an arrow on the weight of our bodies, and the arrow was pointed right into my heart. We had 2 small microphones near our hearts, so we could hear our heartbeats. As our performance was progressing, heartbeats were becoming more and more intense. And though it lasted just 4 minutes and 10 seconds, I'm telling you, for me it was forever. It was a performance about complete and total trust." End quote. Whether audiences loathed or admired them, Marina and Ulay seemed to have been successful in their goal to bring something new and unexpected to the art world. Their ambition to let go of their individual egos to instead merge together to manifest one creative personality was accomplished, and sitting on the summit of the performance art scene. But as the years went by, a pattern was beginning to form. For whatever reason, in spite of their admirable ability to work seamlessly as a duo, the attention of the audience was gradually beginning to shift focus more towards Marina than Ulay. When the media, press, and art magazines would talk about their performances, most would mention Abramović first, and in some cases, they would leave out Ulay altogether, talking only of Marina or mistaking Ulay to be her assistant rather than her counterpart in the performances. Regardless, the couple continued to perform together throughout the 1980s. The most well-known work during this period would be a series of 22 performances that took place between 1981 and 1987 in 19 locations across a number of continents, titled Night Sea Crossing. During the performances, Ulay and Abramović sat completely still and in silence at either end of a table facing each other. In relation to this project would be the work displayed beside it, known as Conjunction, which was deeply inspired by Marina's growing interest in spirituality, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, and the time she and Ulay spent in Australia, coming face to face with Aboriginal culture, which according to Abramović was an experience that proved to be one of her most transformative. Quote, "We chose this culture for many reasons. First, it's nomadic. The second, this culture doesn't have possessions. It's a culture where we always believe in the idea of here and now, which is exactly what performance is about. And the third thing is that their entire life is the ceremony. And this piece, Conjunction, was really historically important because it was the first time ever that an Aborigine and a Tibetan Lama physically ever met. We decided to construct a very large table covered with 24-karat gold leaves, and at that table, Ulay and I are sitting in the Western position, and opposite the table is a Tibetan Lama and a high-degree medicine man sitting in a cross-legged position. We are there sitting 4 days and 7 hours a day, just sitting in a meditative state." End quote. Things did not seem to improve in the relationship between Marina and Ulay, however. Although still deeply caring for each other, they were distancing further from each other. Their passion was beginning to wear thin, and tensions only seemed to rise. The effect their success was having on each of them was also drastically different. Ulay never really cared that much for the lifestyle of fame, or for being in such a spotlight. Being a lifelong anarchist who enjoyed solitude, he began rebelling against what he saw as a growing commercialization of their work. Marina, however, was growing weary of the poor struggling artist's life and welcomed growing success. Sure enough, by 1988, they would make a spiritual journey that would ultimately mark the end of their passionate and intense relationship, an art stunt which at the time had never even been seen before, named Lovers, the Great Wall Walk. What would make this project so bittersweet would not just be the fact that it marked the end of their partnership and relationship, but the fact that it was originally planned for many years prior, in 1983, when they proposed to be the first people to walk the entire distance of the Great Wall of China, the famous ancient monument originally built as a defense against invaders from the north and west of the country. Setting off alone from opposite ends, they planned to meet right in the middle, where they intended to marry each other. The concept exhilarated them both. The idea was so grand, and even in their early stages of planning the stunt, Marina especially knew that it would be nothing short of historic. The couple visualized themselves walking alone across the dramatic landscapes of China, camping under the stars, and romantically concluding their journey through wedlock. They envisioned lovers as not just a great journey to celebrate their love and commitment for each other, but also an art display in which they would be both the performers and the audience. However, it would be no simple feat to accomplish. Initially, the authorities of Beijing reportedly struggled to grasp Ulay and Marina's motives for their excursion. Performance art, especially of their style and caliber, was practically unheard of in China. To them, it seemed rather preposterous to camp and walk along the great historical monument for a quote-unquote art project, not to mention get married on it. Regardless, after many years of pushback, they were finally granted permission when they both agreed to participate in a film of their, quote, study of the Great Wall for Chinese Central Television. But by then, their relationship had completely dissolved. In spite of this, however, they decided to pursue their plans and go ahead with the stunt, changing the narrative from one of marriage to one of separation. The long walk began for them on March 30th, 1988. Abramović set off westwards from the Dragon's Head at the Bodai Sea, an extension of the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean peninsula. Dressed in baggy red clothes, she was, according to an informative article by The Guardian on the lovers' stunt, given the nickname Pa Ma Ta Je, meaning Big Fat Sister Mother. As for Ulay, he began his journey 5,000 kilometers west of Abramović, starting his walk at the Dragon's Tail in the Gobi Desert. The walk proved to be incredibly grueling, with both artists covering a distance of approximately 2,500 kilometers over a period of 90 days. Abramović, walking most of her journey through mountainous regions of China, came across many difficult and inaccessible paths. At one point on her fourth day, after slipping on some rocks, Abramović and her guide found themselves nearly falling to their deaths. Of course, both artists would also see amazing sights along the way, such as locals who had built homes and stables into sections of a winding wall, who would also assist them on their travels and share stories and legends about the land. Many of these crowds from the surrounding towns and villages, fascinated in the artists, silently followed them wherever they went. In one settlement, villagers even gathered around and watched Abramović as she slept. Finally, on a stone bridge, Ulay and Abramović met at the center. Marina would quote on the experience as follows. That walk became a complete personal drama. Ulay started from the Gobi Desert, and I from the Yellow Sea. After each of us walked 2,500 kilometers, we met in the middle and said goodbye. We needed a certain form of ending after walking this huge distance towards each other. It is very human. It is, in a way, more dramatic, more like a film ending, because in the end, you really are alone, whatever you do. End quote. Despite the Chinese press, a group of musicians, and even a fireworks display being prepared for the couple upon the climax of their journey, there would be no wedding ceremony. They simply took part in a press conference together in Beijing, then they returned separately to Amsterdam, and would not speak nor see each other again for 22 years. Although one big chapter of her life had now ended with Ulay, another very significant interest was now fueling Marina, which was finding her sense of deep and personal spirituality, particularly within nature and the unknown. During her hike on the Great Wall, she spoke of how she felt that the metals in the ground influenced her mood and her state of being. She also pondered on the Chinese myths that she was told by the locals, in which the Great Wall had been described as, quote, a dragon of energy. But even before Lovers, during the 1980s, Abramović had deeply immersed herself in Tibetan Buddhism, studying and meditating at monasteries, which would later profoundly impact her understanding of the mind-body connection and the potential for transcendence through artistic expression. But rather than following one spiritual path such as Buddhism exclusively, Marina's spirituality is not confined to any particular religious dogma. Rather, it is a synthesis of various influences that she has encountered throughout her life. Her performances often serve as a form of spiritual exploration, pushing the boundaries of the self and inviting the audience to engage with their own spiritual dimensions, such as allowing the audience to step into shoes made of crystals for a 1991 art piece titled Shoes for Departure, in order to encourage a certain state of mind from the participants. Quote, "I have instructions for the public to take off your shoes and, with naked feet, put on the 2 crystal shoes. Close your eyes, don't move, and make your departure." I'm talking about a mental, not physical departure, so the public can enter certain states of mind, helped by the material itself. Material is very important for me. I use crystals, human hair, copper, iron. The materials already have a certain energy. End quote. Her fascination in meditation taught in Tibetan Buddhism, as well as the profound spiritual connection she developed for the natural world, would only continue to reach new heights throughout the 1990s and kickstart many new concepts. In fact, by 1995, when she was organizing her piece titled Cleaning the Mirror, this would be directly inspired by Tibetan death rites that prepared disciples to become one with their own mortality. Cleaning the Mirror is a series of related performances and video installations that explore themes of mortality, impermanence, and the purification of the soul. Abramović sits on a chair with a complete human skeleton on her lap. A bucket of soapy water stands beside her. For several hours, she meticulously scrubs the bones with a floor brush, cleaning away the dirt and grime that has accumulated on the bones over time. The performance is both physically and emotionally demanding. Abramović's face is often stained with concentration, and her movements are slow and deliberate. The sound of the brush scraping against the bones is amplified, creating a sense of raw intimacy. As Abramović cleans the skeleton, it gradually becomes whiter and more luminous. This could be seen as a metaphor for the cleansing of the soul, or the process of facing one's own mortality. The dirt that is removed from the bones could represent the negative aspects of the self, such as fear, anger, ignorance, pride, and attachment. What makes it more interesting is that in cleaning the skeleton, Marina then becomes the one covered in dirt, symbolizing the transference of these negative qualities, almost like a sacrifice for the benefit of the skeleton. But in truth, cleaning the mirror can be interpreted in many different ways. Some viewers see it as a meditation on death, while others see it as a call to live each moment to the fullest. For Abramović though, the skeleton represents, quote, "the last mirror we will all face," in a work dominated by death and transience. This would not be the only time skeletons would appear in her performances though. For example, later on in her career, she would conceptualize her type of self-portrait performance, titled Nude with Skeleton, which evokes a traditional exercise undertaken by Tibetan monks during which they slept and meditated alongside the dead in various states of decay. Through this practice, they gain an understanding of the process of death and impermanence. Quote, "In different periods of my life, I made several works using a skeleton. I construct the skeleton of my own size, and I lie posing the skeleton on my body. By breathing slowly, the skeleton gets animated and moves together with me. The work is really about facing your own mortality. It's about fear of pain and fear of dying. It's something that, in our life, we all fear the most. And again, in my own work, I always like to confront these fears. So being close to the skeleton, washing it, carrying it, breathing through it, looking at it and confronting it is the way to deal with that fear." End quote. In keeping within the concept of bones and the act of cleaning them, another one of Marina's most famous works of the 90s would be her piece titled Balkan Baroque, first conducted in 1997 in Venice, Italy. But before we can truly attempt to comprehend the concept of this particular piece, we need to look at what exactly inspired it, or rather, what exactly it memorializes. Between 1992 and 1995, a brutal and tragic conflict unfolded in former Yugoslavia, specifically in the multi-ethnic Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was a complex war fueled by ethnic tensions and the breakup of Marina's former country of Yugoslavia, with devastating consequences for the country and its people. Following a referendum on Bosnian independence, Bosnian Serbs declared their own state and an armed conflict erupted. Serb forces, backed by the Yugoslav People's Army, laid siege to major cities like Sarajevo and launched offences to capture territory. The war was marked by horrific acts of ethnic cleansing, where Serb forces systematically expelled or killed Bosniaks and Croats from areas they claimed. The Srebrenica massacre in 1995, where thousands of Bosniak men and boys were murdered, became a chilling symbol of the war's barbarity. The international community initially struggled to respond effectively to the conflict. However, as the atrocities mounted, NATO airstrikes against Serb positions in 1995 helped turn the tide of the war. That same year, the Dayton Accords were signed, bringing an official end to the war. The agreement established a complex power-sharing system for Bosnia and Herzegovina, divided into two entities: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, dominated by the Bosniaks and the Croats, and the Republic of Srpska. Although the war ended, the Bosnian War left deep scars on the land and its people. Over 100,000 lives were lost, and millions were displaced. The war also exposed the dangers of ethnic nationalism and the importance of international cooperation in preventing such conflicts. It's important to remember the Bosnian War not only for its tragic events, but also as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the need for tolerance and understanding in the diverse world that we live in. Naturally, Marina Abramović would be one of the many figureheads who would be deeply affected by the conflict. Quote, "When the war started in Bosnia, it was such a difficult time for me. I was not there. I had been living for such a long time outside the country, and I remember so many artists immediately reacting and making work and protests on the horrors of that war. And I remember that I could not do anything. It was too close to me. I went to Belgrade and I interviewed my mother, my father, and a man who caught rats for 35 years of his life. There are a few things happening in this installation. It's positioned so the hands of my father with a pistol, my mother's fist showing empty hands, and then with crossed hands on her eyes. And then it's me, first as a doctor, telling the story of the rat catcher, and then as a sexy dancer, dancing to the Hungarian Csárdás. And in the meantime, there's a huge pile of bones, which during the entire performance, I'm sitting and washing. It was summer in Venice, very, very hot, and after a few days, already worms started coming out of the bones, and the smell was unbearable. The whole idea that by washing bones and trying to scrub the blood is impossible. You can't wash the blood from your hands, as you can't wash the shame from the war. But also it was important to transcend it. That can be used, this image, for any war, anywhere in the world." End quote. This, personally for me, is my favourite performance of Marina's. I remember seeing a retrospective of this at the Royal Academy in London and just being completely overwhelmed with emotions. I remember staring at the pile of bones for a vast length of time whilst listening to Marina's voice in the background, and let me tell you, it hits you deep like nothing you can imagine. And I felt it was true what she said. Although directly manifested from the horrors of a Bosnian war, in truth, this piece encapsulates the horrors, brutality, and insanity of practically any war, making it such a universally powerful artwork. Ultimately, many people were proven to have felt the same way. This installation earned Abramović the Golden Lion Award at the Venice Biennale that year. At the turn of the new millennium, Marina Abramović at this stage appeared to be revisiting a grassroots concept of hers that arguably served as one of the main factors that shoved her career into the global spotlight from the very beginning, which was an intimate and close interaction between herself and the audience. Throughout the 2000s, Marina would conceptualize installations that would deepen the connection between herself and the spectators. In the wake of the tragedy of 9/11 in 2001, she began working on her piece titled The House with an Ocean View in the following year. That, according to her, served as a means to immerse both herself and the audience in a sort of purifying energy. As explained by her, quote, "House with an Ocean View was for me an experiment. When I came to New York, it was just after September 11th, and I found New York had changed so much. I found New York and people living there different, more emotional, more vulnerable, more spiritual. The idea of the work was an experiment. If I purify myself without eating for 12 days, any kind of food, just drinking pure water, and being in the present moment, here and now, in the 3 units of the wall which represents my house, like the bathroom, the living room, and the sleeping room, where the ladder coming down to the space is made of knives, so you can never leave. That kind of rigorous way of living and purification would do something to change the environment and to change the attitude of people coming to see me. If they will just come and stay and forget about the time. I had in this period people who came just for a few minutes and then stayed for 3 hours, 4 hours, and came the next day to stay even longer, without really understanding what's happening. But there's something like, I almost think that if you are in the present moment, you are purified, and that you can create a kind of energy field that you can charge on an atomic level of the space in a certain way with the public, and feel and just be in the present time." End quote. However, one groundbreaking durational piece that seemed to capture the most intimacy between herself and the audience, as well as receive the most worldwide attention in recent years, was between March 14th to May 31st in 2010 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. For 3 months, she sat motionless in a chair, inviting visitors to take the opposite seat and silently engage with her gaze. Titled "The Artist is Present," the performance became a landmark event in contemporary art, sparking profound emotional connections and raising questions about human presence, vulnerability, and connection. Quote, "I have the empty chair, so everybody from the audience can come on their free time and sit in front of me and engage in this kind of silence, experience of the here and now, the present moment. So you can observe this as kind of a stage for the experience, or you can really enter that space and take active participation, which actually brings you much closer to the artist and this presence and to your own experience. If you sit on this chair opposite me, it's extremely important to actually find a very comfortable position and you don't move. Just sit motionless and see what happens if we connect our eyes. and I really think that it's going to be something quite special to go into this unknown territory. Because of the energy coming from the audience, I have to be the transmitter and receiver at the same time. That energy just goes through me, and to be ready for the next visitor, and the next one, and the next one." End quote. Of course, each encounter was unique from person to person. Some simply stared, some smiled, some would burst into tears, and one woman, as seen in the artist's present documentary, would even attempt to strip naked before sitting opposite her, but would subsequently be escorted out by security. For those who did sit opposite her though, what's fascinating to see is that Abramović would completely mirror the expressions and emotions of her sitters. For example, if someone would cry, she too would start crying, sharing that exact same emotion together in an incredible moment of oneness. Understandably though, due to the nature of the piece, that sitters could choose the duration of time spent with Marina, with some sitting for just a few minutes and others up to an entire day. This made tensions within the sometimes endless queue of people difficult to control at times, almost being a callback to the raw public energy captured within her Rhythm Zero performance. By the end of it, Abramović sat across 1,545 sitters in total, including an impressive list of celebrities such as James Franco, Lou Reed, Alan Rickman, Jemima Kirk, Jennifer Carpenter, Orlando Bloom, and Bjork. However, one of the earliest sitters during the retrospective that would garner viral attention would be none other than Ulay himself. After many years of not seeing each other ever since the Great Wall of China, Ulay arrived unannounced at the museum. He would sit down opposite Marina. As she looked up and opened her eyes to see who was sitting opposite her, the moment captured between them both is quite simply so powerful. The overwhelming joy they both have for seeing each other again is quite clear to see, and he can't help but feel moved by this moment. It's worth remembering this is a woman who went through Rhythm Zero, despite being cut, threatened, abused, and nearly shot with a loaded gun. But to see Ulay again was the moment that broke her. Putting that into perspective really does show the care that they still had for each other back then. It's just a shame that Ulay and Marina then got into a messy royalties dispute no more than 5 years later. Like, talk about a bittersweet relationship. But in any case, the artist's presence remains a pivotal moment in contemporary art history. It continues to be celebrated for its raw emotional power, its exploration of human connection, and its challenge to the conventions of artistic practice, and one that Marina claimed changed her life entirely by the end of it. So I want to end this documentary by talking about something that I know is going to get a lot of mixed opinions. Although at this point it's fair to say that Marina Abramović was not one to shy away from controversy or incredibly bold ideas for her performances, and in spite of the boundaries she had already pushed even earlier on in her career, nothing would be quite as divisive and incredibly outlandish as her provocative performance that I've not yet mentioned, known as Spirit Cooking. Conceived in 1996. Always gotta save the best till last, eh? This particular project began with an idea for a book, a cookbook to be precise, that would be a collaborative effort between her and printer-publisher Jacob Samuel in her Amsterdam studio. As explained on the Museum of Modern Art website, quote, "The artist chose to make a cookbook, writing a series of aphrodisiac recipes that serve as evocative instructions for actions or thoughts. To allow the artist to create the accompanying etches in a manner consistent with her body-oriented practice, Samuel prepared the plates with a soft ground so she could scratch directly on the surface with her fingernails, and encouraged her to work with spit bite, using her own saliva with nitric acid to paint on the plate." End quote. These quote-unquote aphrodisiac recipes were essentially playfully provocative poems by Abramović, inspired by the popular folk belief that ghosts feed off intangible things like light, sound, and emotions. Jacob Samuel would comment on the concept as follows. In 1994, I designed a portable studio that I could put in a crate and ship all over the world so I could work with artists in their own studios. I wanted to be able to work with artists in their own environments and see where that would lead. Marina was very open to whatever I suggested in terms of technique, but right away I could see that she had a very specific working process. Because she's a performance artist, and because she uses her body for everything, she was a little uncomfortable drawing with a pencil or an etching needle. So I suggested that we use soft ground and that she draw with her fingernails. And occasionally she would use her fingerprints. She used spit bite aquatint, which she liked to use because it actually mixes the artist's saliva with nitric acid. So again, it's related to her body. This is exactly what I hoped would happen by creating a portable studio, that the artist would be so in tune with their own environment that translating it into another physical context would be irrelevant. End quote. So, if it's just supposed to be a fantasy cookbook consisting of make-believe recipes, what exactly provoked so much controversy compared to her other work? Well, if we take a look at a few examples, you'll quickly notice that some of these are extremely bizarre and at times straight up grotesque, ranging from eating 9 red hot peppers whilst facing a wall to, and I'm not even kidding here, mixing fresh breast milk with fresh sperm milk. So to someone completely unfamiliar with Marina's outlandish creative personality, it's clear to see how this would be quite shocking to the unsuspecting eye. But the project would not just end there. In the following year of 1997, Abramović conducted a multimedia spirit cooking installation at a gallery in Rome, Italy, where she would write strange instructions and recipes in pig's blood all over the white walls of a showroom. Phrases included things like, spin around until you lose consciousness, try to eat all the questions of the day, or saliva of your lover mixed with morning dew collected from eucalyptus leaves would just be a few examples. Now again, given what we know of her work in the past, this is pretty shocking and gruesome, but relatively nothing out of the ordinary when it comes to Abramović in the grand scheme of things. With a great deal of context removed, I can certainly see how this would look barbaric and, I guess I'll use that word now, satanic. But the fact is, if you really want to find out why this received so much backlash, I'm afraid that will involve going down a conspiracy theory rabbit hole, and I hate to break it to you, but this is an art channel, not a conspiracy theory channel. There's also a lot of American politics involved with the conspiracy as well, and, well, have you heard my accent? American politics is not exactly my strong suit either, so that's really as far as I will go for this one, I'm afraid. Obviously, people are completely entitled to think what they will when it comes to this particular work of hers. Like I said, I can completely understand why this would provoke such a reaction. I'm sure if she decided to put on more nice sounding recipes, like mix gumdrops with daisies and feed off for happiness, and it was all written in sugar icing, I'm pretty sure no one would even bat an eyelid. But if you're watching this video expecting to hear what I personally think, I honestly have no other opinion other than, well yeah, it's Marina Abramović. It doesn't exactly surprise me that she would work on something like this. Do I share her beliefs or her perspectives? No. Whether or not she's a Satanist or a witch, whatever word you want to use, quite frankly that's none of my business. My focus on this channel is on the artwork itself, and whatever proven, reliable facts are available for me to research from. If you like conspiracies, that's totally fine, but I personally don't consider these things to be reliable sources of information. I'm sorry. If one day it comes out that Marina is confirmed beyond reasonable doubt that she is more, shall we say, morally questionable than we initially thought, then I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But for now, all I see Marina Abramović as is an extremely blunt, raw, outrageous, provocative, and controversial performance artist that not everybody is going to love. But here's the thing. If we lived in a world where every solitary thing was objectively something to like or hate, just what kind of existence would that be? The world has never been neat little boxes and categories, and to think otherwise is simply unrealistic. And that's the true beauty of art. It's one of the few things we've created as a species that points out these kind of complexities of life, because art is limitless and doesn't have to have rules. I would absolutely be lying if I said I like every project Abramović has conducted though. I'll be honest, I'm not even sure I fully get her or agree with her most of the time. Sometimes I think she does go too far. Sometimes I do feel like some of her performances are just exploitative or self-deprecation on display. Sometimes I think the way she treats people is completely selfish and insensitive based on what I've read in her book. Sometimes I think her art isn't my idea of art at all. But let me ask you something. Whether you love her or absolutely despise her, can you honestly say, regardless of how you feel about her, that she hasn't had some kind of impact on you? In my eyes, if that's not the result of a successful artist, then I don't know what is. I think performance art is one of those anomalies within creativity that's always going to get very split reactions. Don't get me wrong, I've seen some terrible performance art, and I too pick and choose what constitutes real art based on my own experiences and personal tastes. But that's exactly my point. There should never be a definitive answer within art. It's just like music. Just because you don't like a certain genre of music, that doesn't necessarily mean the genre is definitively bad. Or if I don't like a certain type of food, again, just because I have different preferences, that doesn't mean that the chef who cooked it is all of a sudden bad at cooking. I know it seems like an obvious thing to say, but I can't help but feel when it comes to this certain genre of contemporary art, that people tend to forget this side of things. And Marina Abramović is an artist who I don't think I'll ever truly be able to fully wrap my head around. I find her fascinating, but even going to her retrospective at the Royal Academy left me feeling both inspired and on the other hand feeling like, okay, what the fuck did I just witness? But having said that, I can't think of another experience in art quite like it, so I absolutely consider that noteworthy. In conclusion then, despite the criticisms and controversies, the legacy of Marina Abramović remains undeniable. She's challenged our understanding of art, pushed the boundaries of human performance, and fostered profound moments of connection between artist and audience, many times almost effortlessly. Her work continues to inspire awe and introspection, drawing in huge crowds of people worldwide, sparking huge debates, of course, all ensuring her place as one of the most influential artists presently alive today, whether for better or for worse. She's been relatively quiet with new ideas in recent years, mostly leaving it to the hard-working new generation of performance artists from her Marina Abramović Institute. But it will be interesting to see how both her most loyal fans and her most passionate haters will react to whatever she has next in store. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found this documentary interesting. As always, a huge thank you to all of my patrons and channel members. Here's a special shout out to all of my top tier donators. Leslie Simon, Laurie Gallardo, Port Perea, Miles Z, Great, Vlad Ziv, Tyler Butler, Eric Lamarca, Dave MC, Molotale, H's Place, Equatomok, Lee Flowers, Calvin Kai, Benuongon 24, Akaiza, Charlie Sanchezi, Ken B, and Carol H. That's all from me this time. Thanks again for watching. See you in the next one soon. Keep being creative, and bye for now.